Howdy possums, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin. I am the owner of the Plundering Possum, which is my small upcycling business. If you're unclear on what upcycling is, it is the process of thrifting or reusing old materials and making new things out of it. And I do that for the purpose of reducing waste and creating sustainable designs out of things that already exist rather than buying new things like fast fashion. For today's tutorial, I'm going to teach you how to make patchwork sweatpants out of completely recycled materials. If anybody's unclear on what patchwork sweatpants look like, here's a pair I made for my mom for Christmas. They are fishing sweatpants, and you can see they're patchwork. They have different designs on them, and I loved using the fish design in this piece because my mom loves fishing. And this was actually a recycled men's button-up that I used. Sweatshirt, more sweatshirt, and this was a Carhartt t-shirt that I recycled. Before I get started on showing you how to make the patchwork sweatpants, I do want to preface, I would say this tutorial is more for intermediates. If you have followed any of my other tutorials on making a flannel, a hoodie, or especially the t-shorts that are made out of 2 t-shirts, you can definitely handle this. However, if this is your first project, I definitely recommend my flannel video that's very beginner friendly, or trying a simpler project like a scrunchie or a keychain before trying this. And with that, let's start plundering. When making patchwork sweatpants, there are a lot of supplies you're going to need. To start, you're going to want a staple piece. So this is more like an alternative fabric I'm going to mix in, but here are some champion pieces. This is going to be the staple piece, which is just the main graphic of the patchwork sweatpants. For these sweatpants, I'm going to include these 3 just to use up some of my spare staple pieces and make it a little bit more interesting. Next, you're going to need fabric to cut up. I will show you how to cut up new fabric, which for me, new would be a hoodie or a pair of sweatpants or just anything that I have thrifted but not yet cut up. Like I said, I'll show you how to cut up one thing, but I'm going to use mainly scraps for this piece because I do strive to be sustainable and use up all the things that I purchase. The next thing you will need is a mold or a pattern. This pattern is made out of cardboard or this cardstock that I cut up, and I understand most people will not have this material readily available or the dimensions readily available. So for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make a pair of sweatpants for yourself out of a pre-existing pair that you own. So instead of using this as the molder pattern, you're going to use your own pair of sweatpants as the molder pattern. You won't cut them up. I'll show you how to do this later on in the video. This right here is what I use to measure the waistband, which once again, you won't have to have that. You can just use the waistband on your sweatpants. However, I would recommend making a pocket mold or pattern because you're not going to be able to measure that very well on your sweatpants that you already have. You can see the dimensions for this mold or pattern right here. So you can see that it is about 7.5 inches wide, 13.5 inches tall, and this little section right here is about 11 inches. You don't have to get the shape perfect. You just want to get this general curve right here, and then this straight section is very important. These holes you also want to mark, and it will make sense why later, but basically this section right here is where you're going to stick your hand into the pocket. Next, you will need a rotary cutter so you can cut straight lines on your fabric. You'll need fabric scissors to cut your fabric, thread to sew. You don't have to have many scissors, but I like them for cutting small loose threads. Pins or clips. I prefer clips, but pins will work just fine. Adhesive spray so that you can back the materials that you use. I will show you what backing is later on in the video. You will need elastic for the waistband. You're going to need a lot more than this. You don't have to have a straight edge, but I like to use this long one for the longer pieces that I cut. You'll need a drawstring for the waistband. I either use shoelaces or extra drawstrings from hoodies. You will also need grommets so that you can thread the drawstring through the waistband. I use this little machine right here. I'm not exactly sure what it's called. However, I have done it in the past with just a hammer and the tools that the grommets come with, which you can find at Hobby Lobby for a few dollars. And finally, after all of this has been accumulated, you are obviously going to need a sewing machine and a serger. You don't have to have a serger, however, I like it because it reinforces all the seams of the things you sew together. You can use a sewing machine to act like a serger through the zigzag stitch. There's tutorials online for that. It's very simple, however, it is tedious. So if you have a serger, I recommend using it. If you don't have one, it's fine, but I would recommend reinforcing your seams with a zigzag stitch. The first step in making upcycled patchwork sweatpants is to cut up your materials. I'm going to show you how to specifically cut up this hoodie. However, the method I'm going to show you applies for cutting up anything, whether that be sweatshirts, sweatpants, t-shirts, any other thing that you will be cutting up for your sweatpants. First, you want to turn the fabric inside out. Once it's inside out, you're going to start by cutting off all of the appendages or extra pieces, which are going to be the ribbing, the arms, and the hood. Whenever you're cutting, you want to cut and leave the seam, this section right here, you want to leave that on the body of the hoodie. You don't want to leave it on the appendage. So instead of cutting on this side, I'm going to cut on this side. You just want to get a little nibble without cutting too much, and then you're going to cut along that seam all the way around. The same thing you did with the ribbing, you're going to do for each arm and the hood. When you've cut off one arm, you're going to do the same thing you're doing with the body, but with the cuff. So when you cut the cuff off, you're going to leave that seam right there on the arm and don't leave it on the cuff. Once the cuff is off the sleeve, you're going to get this seam right here and cut it all the way down. It doesn't matter which side you leave this on because it's still going to be on the arm regardless, so just pick a side that's easiest. When you're cutting the hood, make sure you don't cut through the drawstrings and you know where they are on the inside. When you're left with just the body, the next thing you're going to cut are the shoulders. There should be seams there, and it doesn't matter which side you cut on, just cut whichever side is easiest. We are almost done cutting, or what I like to call dissecting. The last thing we need to do is cut the seams along the side. Now, not all hoodies have a seam. This one doesn't. So instead of cutting both sides, we're just going to cut through one. And now we have a giant open piece of fabric that we can use to make our sweatpants. No matter what you're cutting up, whether it be a baby t-shirt or a giant hoodie, you're going to cut it up the same. Just turn it inside out, cut the appendages off, and then open up the body by cutting the side seams and the shoulders. For t-shirts, you don't have to cut that off because it's not an extra appendage, if you will. There's no ribbing here. This is just the hem of the shirt. With t-shirts, you don't have to cut off a cuff because once again, it's just a hem. Just make sure you cut that seam on the bottom. And this is going to be too small to use in anything, so I'm just going to put it in my scrap box. But the big t-shirts, you do want to keep extra t-shirt material because you can use it later in the project. This shirt does have an extra side seam. You can cut through it if you like. For this piece of fabric, I'm actually going to leave it as is. I usually don't like having those seams showing whenever I piece everything together. However, this is such a small graphic to work with. I'm going to leave it as is, but usually I would cut along that seam and have two body pieces. Now that you have everything cut up, I'm going to show you how to use your sweatpants to make a mold or a pattern. So however you want your sweatpants to fit, find a pair of sweatpants that fit you perfectly or have the fit or desired style that you would like. I'm going to go for a baggy loose fit for me, so I chose my favorite Adidas sweatpants. Once again, don't worry, you will not be cutting these up unless you do it accidentally. You're only going to be using this as a pattern. You will have to use each panel, so you're going to have to use a front and back panel for the right leg and a front and back panel for the left leg. To do the front panels, you're going to pinch the crotch right here where all the seams connect, where the inseams are and where the crotch connects. Grab the waistband up here and pull it up. You see how I have that straight crotch seam right there? You're gonna kind of line up your sweatpants and fold them in half and then line everything up perfectly. Kind of to give you a side-by-side comparison, you're going to have a curved part for the crotch right here, and you can see that on my mold right here. Additionally, you can see on both, I'm going for a straight leg fit, but just because it's straight leg doesn't mean it's straight all the way down. You can see it kind of tapers in, and that's what this is also illustrating. To do the front panel for the other leg, all you have to do is flip that over and make sure it all lines up. And here is your other front panel. Now, do not make this mistake. I made this as a beginner. You can't just make two front panels for the left leg and two front panels for the right and think, oh, that'll work for the back. It does not. The back panels are larger to account for your hips and your glutes. And so you're going to have to flip your sweatpants to the back to get the back panel. I just pinch the crotch, pick it up, and then kind of lay it out. And here is the back panel. and here's the other back panel. I'll show you one more time how to fold it and orient it correctly. So find the crotch seam where the inseams line up and the crotch is sewn together. It's kind of like a little four corners deal, and pinch that. Then pinch the top of your waistband where the crotch seam lines up. Pick it up, kind of lay it down, and you're going to fold the pant legs over each other. And straighten it out. Now we get to do the fun part, which is actually make the sweatpants. If this is your first time making an upcycled item, I would recommend doing something like this pant leg. You don't have to have a piece this big, but what I mean is more in the design. So only do straight across panels and don't do long panels like this. The reason for that is when you do patchwork, you have to make sure you're not sewing yourself into a corner. So for example, I would sew these two pieces together first, right here, and then I would sew them here. I would sew these two onto this. However, if you sewed this black Carhartt onto the fish first, you would create a corner you have to sew that red into, and that is really difficult to do. And you can make it work, but I have a hard time. It usually looks funky. So I recommend doing like this if it's your first time and just having straight across cuts. One final thing to remember before you start to cut things is to remember seam allowance. I usually allow 1/2 inch, which is pretty generous just because when I go through the serger, I just kind of lop off the extra and I don't really worry about making it perfect. However, most people probably do closer to 1/4 inch, but for seam allowance, you basically don't want to cut right along the edge. You just want to leave a little bit of room and cut more like right here. Be extra careful when you're cutting the pieces on top of your sweatpants and make sure you don't cut the sweatpants underneath. Seam allowance is not just for the outsides, remember it's for the inside pieces as well. And you may be thinking, Caitlin, the t-shirt material is way more thin than the sweatshirt material. And yes, it is, and that is what backing is. So just cut your pieces how you like, cut the t-shirts how you like, and I'm going to show you how to thicken up this material before you sew it together. This is also the point where you can use the rotary cutter. I'm just so used to cutting it, and like I said, I leave extra and just lop it off whenever I serge, so I don't worry about it. But if this is your first time, I would recommend cutting straight lines with the rotary cutter and your cutting board. Whenever you get to the waistband, you still want to do seam allowance and allow for that extra waistband part, but not seam allowance up here. You want to do seam allowance down here where the waistband starts. So I'm going to cut about right here. Once again, not at the top, but seam allowance based on the bottom of where the waistband starts. Here is one finished pant leg. I like to cut it first, sew one pant leg together, and then kind of see how the panels work. It's just easier for me to visualize. So if you want, you can cut all 4 panels right now. I'm just going to cut one. I'll show you how to back the thin pieces, and then I will come back and cut the other 3 and sew the other 3. Now is your time to grab your spray adhesive and some unwanted fabric. I'm going to use this blue because it has a stain right there, and then grab the piece that you want to back or thicken up, or just the t-shirt that you're using. The first step is to grab your fabric and lay it down on top. Once you've done that, straighten it out. Usually when you're backing a piece like this yellow champion, you want to use fabric that fits the whole thing. You can see I'm kind of overlapping on the corners there. However, I've done this for so long, I now know that I've cut it wide enough where it's going to be fine. However, if you are a beginner, once again, I want to emphasize using the rotary cutter and doing perfectly straight edges is the best way to go. At this point, you want to grab your adhesive and shake it up. You're going to lift up the sides and spray underneath. You're going to do this for each corner. You don't need a lot because you don't need this to stick forever. You just want it to stick to the back until you sew it together. You're going to want to grab your straight edge and your rotary cutter and cut out this panel right here. And now you have t-shirt material that is just as thick as sweatshirt material. And now you can see when I come back to my mold, I'd left so much extra that there's still enough on the sides and to overlap on the other panels. The seam allowance thing usually comes with time. Like I said, I just allow so much extra that whenever I cut it off, because I didn't make perfectly straight edges, it will still be big enough to fit the area it needs to. Now that I am done with my first panel, I'm going to sew it all together. Whenever you're sewing patchwork, all you're doing is flipping the pieces on top of each other so the outside is facing in and the inside is facing out. After serging, you're going to have one finished panel. Once again, you can sew it, you can serge it, it doesn't matter. Just make sure that you know it's secure, and you can do that by just pulling right here, and you can see that seam is not ripping. So I know it's secure. Here's what my first finished panel looks like. If you've done your first panel and you forgot what side you made it on, you can put it up to yourself and the crotch is going to curve in like this. So I know this is a front right panel. You're going to make all the other panels the same way as the first. So I'm going to speed run through the rest. Once again, I have to reiterate, make sure you know which panel you are making. There's been so many times I've made 2 right panels, and as you can see, if I make 2 front right panels, the crotch has to face in. That's not gonna work. So like I said, make it one at a time, make sure you're really thinking it through, and I like to make the front panels first and then the back panels. Just in case you mess up, you can switch it to the other side. So if I mess this up and this was supposed to be a back right panel, that would not work. So instead of wasting the fabric, I can make it a back left panel. I do not know if you can see that, and put it on the other side. I don't know if that necessarily makes sense. That's just kind of how I think about it. I'm going to finish, and then we are going to assemble all of the panels together. Once you've made the first front panel, you can just flip it over and use it to make the second front panel, and that way you can make sure they are the same size and you don't have to worry about messing with your pants. Here you can see in real time how the patches are sewn together. I flip one on top of the other so that the inside is facing out, and then I just serge it together, or you can sew it together. I know even with the 20x speed on, this part still kind of drags on, but I think it's important to show how long it really takes to go through the process of making patchwork sweatpants, especially since I cut up all my little scraps so I can save them for later. If you've made it this far in the video, you should have all 4 panels done of your patchwork sweatpants, and now you'll need to grab your pocket mold or pocket pattern. If you do not have a pre-made mold or pattern, go back to this section of the video where I explain everything that you're going to need to make the patchwork sweatpants, and I give you the dimensions of what I use, and as long as you get this general shape, you're gonna be okay. Here's kind of a reference, I guess. I have a normal size head, so like 2 head length, I don't know. Just get this general shape and you're gonna be okay. To make the pockets, you're going to need your pocket pattern or mold, a pair of scissors, and t-shirt material. You don't have to have t-shirt material, but I think it just looks and feels better, and it's not as bulky underneath your pants. Like I said, sweatshirt material is fine. If you don't have any t-shirt material, I would just recommend t-shirts. To start, grab one of your t-shirts and see if it's big enough to be a pocket. This is not, so I will set it aside. This covers the whole pattern or mold, so I'm going to use this piece. All you need to do is lay your t-shirt or your material out flat, put the pattern or mold on top, and cut around. The pockets do not have to be cut perfect. I usually just serge a lot of it off. However, if you want to make it perfect or it's your first time, then I would suggest cutting it exactly to whatever you're using for your mold or pattern. And once you have one shape, you're going to use this and make 3 more. I find it easier to cut around the fabric than I do to cut around this right here. And so I'm going to use this as my new pattern or mold and make 4 total pockets. Once you're done cutting the pockets, you're going to sew one onto each pant leg. Now's your time to grab your clips or your pins, and we're going to attach each pocket to each pant leg panel. When you cut the pockets, you'll remember there's one shorter straight side, a kind of cut across, and then it goes into the bottom curve. You want this side, the short side, to line up with the outside part of your panel, which will become the outseam of the pants. I will show you how to do this a few times. It is kind of tricky. So on panel number 1, you can see the curve, which is the crotch, facing this way, which means the outseam is going to be this way towards me. So I'm going to take my pocket and I'm going to line up the short straight side with the outside seam of the pants. Once you line it up straight, you can pin or clip. For the next panel, the curve or the crotch is facing that way, so the pocket is going to be sewn onto this side. I'm going to take the short edge, flip it to where it lines up with the outside, and pin or clip. One thing you'll notice is that when I'm done clipping, the pocket is laying on top of the panel. It's not laying this way. You want it to be laying on top because we're going to serge or sew this right here, flip it over, and then sew it again. For now, let's just worry about getting the pockets on correctly. So I'm going to grab my pocket, crotch is on this side, so pocket will go on this side. And last time, the crotch is facing this way, so the pocket is going this way. You'll also notice that when I clip these, the top of the pocket lines up with the top of each leg. Now that you're done clipping, I'm going to show you how to serge or sew it on. I prefer serging, so I'm going to serge the pocket first, but you are more than welcome to sew it. Whenever you're serging or sewing over t-shirt material, it's a lot more stretchy and movable, so just make sure that you keep it lined up and don't let it flop around. If you are serging, don't forget to check and make sure that your cutter is cutting off both layers. You don't have to use the cutter, but I like it because it makes a nice and clean seam rather than having kind of bunches and gathers where the fabric kind of accumulates together. When you get to the end, you are going to serge a little bit off on the red or whatever color you're using. You're just going to go off the pocket a little bit and then pull your piece out. So here you can see I serged onto that red a little bit. That is perfectly fine. It'll be covered up later. You just want to make sure you catch that final corner of the pocket and don't miss it. When you flip it out, this is what it should look like, and you should have a nice strong seam and it should not rip. Once you've serged or sewn on the pocket, you're going to have a seam like this on the inside, and when you flip it to the outside, you're going to top stitch the pocket down. Whenever you're top stitching, you want to make sure that you're top stitching onto this seam. So when I flip this over, you don't want the seam to be folded over here, because then when you sewed the pocket, you wouldn't be sewing onto anything. You want it to be flipped towards the pocket so that when I sew right there, it's going to tack down that seam and it's going to be even more secure. I always like to go a few stitches forward and then back stitch a few times. When you get to the end, remember to back stitch a few times. And if you did it right, you can see that it has a nice, clean, straight edge, and the seam on the back is tacked down and you can't flip it over anymore. I'm going to show you how to do it one more time with the opposite pant leg. So I'm going to start a little bit on this dark blue, and whenever you have to start from the other side, just make sure that t-shirt stays down and doesn't start folding back like this. So make sure it's pushed under there. You can take your first clip off and then start serging. Here's what the inside of the pocket should look like. You're going to flip it out, make sure your seam is strong, and start sewing. And here's the finished pocket. After you have 4 panels with the pockets sewn on, you can begin assembling your patchwork sweatpants. I'm going to insert a warning here. Don't jump ahead and sew the pocket side. There is a very specific way you have to sew that, so make sure you follow these steps in the exact order or you're going to end up messing up the pockets. If you want to pick the leg you want to sew together first, I'm going to pick my right leg. I have my 2 back panels and my 2 front panels, so you're going to find your right. I know this is the right front panel because it's the smaller one, and the the crotch is facing inward. It's not like this where this is obviously the back of the fabric and now it's facing in. So I know this is the front right panel, and I'm going to do the same but for the back. So I know this is the back right panel because when I put it on the back right here, the crotch is facing in. So now that I have my two right leg panels, I'm going to show you how to sew them together. For this part, you're just going to need the two panels and clips. The first step is to flip one of the sides on top of the other and make sure that the back of the fabric is facing out. Once you flip it over, you're going to clip it and you're doing the inseam. So you're gonna find the corner bottom part of the crotch seam, which is this right here. You're going to line them up on both sides, clip it, and then clip or pin all the way down the inseam. When you clip, always make sure you start at the top where the crotch is and not the bottom, because as you can see, I made one of my pant legs a little bit longer, and that's perfectly fine. You're just going to chop it off at the end. If you started clipping or pinning at the bottom and worked your way up, then the crotch area would be shorter, and that's kind of hard to fix, so just make sure you always start up at the top. Now you're going to come to your serger or sewing machine and sew the inseam. Whenever you're done, it should look somewhat like this. You're going to have the two pockets on the outside. The curved section in the middle is the crotch. The part you've sewn is the inseam, and when you fold it over and we sew this side right here, that is going to be your outseam. So here's what it's going to look like on me. This is the front and this is the back. You're going to do the exact same thing for the other leg, whichever one you didn't do first. So now I'm going to go sew the left leg, and then I'm going to show you how to piece together the crotch and then the outseam. At this point, you should have two pant legs that are sewn together through the inseam, and now we're going to sew the crotch. To do this, you're going to take one of your legs. So I'm going to choose this one. This is the front panel for this leg, and this is the front panel for this leg, and I'm going to flip the front panels on top of each other and the back panels on top of each other. So here you can see I have the two fronts on top of each other and the two backs on top of each other. So to pin this, what you're going to do is find the inseams for both legs. So here you can see them both right here, and you're going to kind of pinch them together and clip. Once you've got that first clip in along the inseams, it's pretty easy. You're just going to clip or pin all the way up both sides of the crotch. If you cut your panels correctly and sewed them correctly on the inseam, you can see that mine line up pretty good at the top corners. And once you have all that done, you can sew the crotch seam. When you're sewing the crotch, it doesn't matter which side you start on. Just pick a side, thread it into your serger or your sewing machine, and then serge or sew around. It is going to curve. Just make sure you line it up as you go and then go with the curve. Once you're done sewing this crotch seam, you're going to finagle the pants to get them laid out how they would look when they're on your body. So they're going to look like this on me. And don't freak out if whenever you're done with the crotch seam, you can't get them to lay out like this immediately. It did take me a second, and I honestly thought I sewed it backwards, and I was about to be in tears, guys. I've gone through this whole video, thought I did it wrong, but it just, like I said, takes some finagling. Once you get it laid out like this, you're going to need two things. You're going to need your pocket molder pattern, as well as a chalk marker, fabric marker, or even a pen, but I prefer things that wash out in the washer. Once again, you don't have to have this, but at this point we're making the holes for you to put your hands into, and so this is about 7.5 to 8 inches, which is perfect for me. If you're making these shorts for a tall man, you probably want it to be more like 9 or 10 inches. That's what my fiance prefers. Just make sure that you kind of accommodate the size. I am 5'7", and I am an average size. I wear usually a small or a medium, and I like the 7.5 to 8 inch hand opening for the pockets. Also, I will say these markings, you're not going to cut or do anything with them. They're just going to show you how far to sew into the pocket. You're going to want to line up your mold, your ruler, your pattern with the pocket and make 2 little dots like I did right here. And that is basically how far you're going to sew when you sew the outseam. Because if you sewed all the way down, there wouldn't be a spot to put your hand. So what you're going to do is sew down to this dot, leave this open, and then sew from that dot to the end of your pants. You're going to want to do the dots on both sides. So I'm going to flip my pockets and make 2 more dots. Once you've made your dots, you're going to turn your pants inside out, and then we're going to go to the sewing machine and sew them together. If you've been serging with me through this process, do not serge the outseam first. I serge after. I always sew first because there's a lot of different moving parts with it. You're gonna have to sew the pocket, you're gonna have to sew these two extra bits right here. I just highly recommend sewing the outseam first. So like I said, you're going to flip your pants inside out. This is where, if you're a beginner, I would recommend pinning wherever you put your dots, which I'm just now realizing I put the dots on the inside. That's perfectly fine. Whenever you're sewing, you can just kind of flip it over and look where you put it. So what you want to do whenever you pin or clip is you're gonna have these two top stitch sections of your pockets. You want to make sure those line up. You can kind of push them together like that to see, and then whenever you pin it, you just kind of line them up and then just work your way down. The reason you want those to line up perfectly is because what we're going to do is sew just a little bit beyond the seam right here, and it's going to hide the top stitching for the little portion we're doing, and then you'll have the top stitching exposed so it looks like a nice pocket, and then hide it again down here. But if you sew and they're not lined up, so let's say if you have that top stitching there and this top stitching here, you can see how it's not lined up. Let's say I sew down there, well then you're gonna have all this kind of exposed. So once again, just make sure your top stitching lines up with the top stitching on the other pocket. I'm so used to doing this, I don't use the pins anymore, but the same thing is going to apply if you are using pins. So you're just going to kind of peek at the top and make sure those top stitching layers are lined up. And whenever you sew, you're going to sew just a little bit beyond the seam on this side. Go forward a few stitches and then back stitch. Like I said before, I did do the dots on the wrong side. That's perfectly fine though. You can still peek and see how far you're going. So since I don't pin, I kind of pull it up and make sure it's lined up, and I'll go a few stitches forward. I'll peek again, see how I'm doing, line it up, go forward a little more. And I just keep repeating that until I get roughly to where my dot is, which is right there. So I'll put my finger down kind of near it. So once I get to roughly where my dot is, I'm going to backstitch and forward stitch probably 2 or 3 times because I want to make sure it's really secure. Because when we go and serge the outseam and the rest of this, you won't be able to serge over that. After I do that a few times, I'm going to lift up my presser foot and pull my project out. This is what it should look like. You're going to have a little stitching right there, just right by the seam you've already done. Now we're going to do the same thing, but for the bottom of the pocket. Here, I'm going to peek and see where my dot is. If you remember how we ended the stitch up here, we backstitched and forward stitched multiple times. You're going to want to do the same down here, but instead of the end, you're going to do it at the beginning because this is where you're putting your hands in and you can't serge up on this pocket. Once you've gone beyond the pocket, you're okay to kind of pull your project out. You don't have to finish stitching all the way down. I just like to though, because I think it reinforces the outseam, which is a crucial part of the patchwork sweatpants. Don't forget to backstitch when you reach the end. We're going to do the same thing for the other side, so line up the top stitching, lift up the presser foot, and place your project in. If you didn't pin or clip yours, make sure to peek underneath every now and again and make sure that you line up the top stitching. There's my dot, so I'm going to kind of mark it with my finger and sew down. Don't forget to backstitch at least 2 or 3 times on this part to reinforce it. Your project is really starting to look like sweatpants now, and now we are going to serge the outseam, but we can't serge through the pocket. However, the pocket is not closed yet. So what you're going to do is line up the edges of the pocket, and you're going to serge around the curve to this point right here. You're gonna have to do some finagling, but then you're gonna try to kind of pull it straight and then serge all the way down the outseam. Once again, if you don't have a serger, you can do a zigzag stitch, and there are tutorials out there on how to use a sewing machine to act like a serger. Once you're ready to serge, you're going to grab your sweatpants and start at the top corner pocket. Make sure it's lined up as best you can. You're gonna put it into your serger and serge around. Remember, when you're serging, you're going to serge down straight for a little bit, but then there's gonna be a pocket curve, and then it goes into the outseam of the pants. There will be some finagling involved, so just make sure you watch closely. If you are serging with the cutter on, make sure you're going through both layers of your pocket. Through the curve, just make sure you carefully guide it. It should be going smoothly around the fabric. If not, it may be an issue with your serger settings, or you made your pockets too small. As you can see, I can easily guide it around this curve. Here is that weird corner area that's approaching. Whenever you go through it, just try to straighten it out like this. Make sure you catch this corner right here so there's not a hole in your pocket, and then you're going to serge all the way down. I'm going to show you how to do it again on the other side. Just make sure you watch closely. You can see I got both layers of my pocket. Gently guide the serger around the curve. And as you approach this kind of weird area, make sure you get the t-shirt so there's not a hole, and then serge down the outseam. Here is what the pants should look like after you finish serging the pockets and the outseams, and now you can flip it right side out. They are looking so good, and here you can see what the pockets look like from the outside. You can see there's no top stitching here or down here, but you have a pocket to put your hand into right in the middle. Now all we have left to do is the waistband and to hem the bottoms. Hemming is pretty easy. The waistband is a little tricky, so make sure you guys are locked in for this part. What you're going to want to do is make a waistband that is 5 inches wide, and then however wide your pants are. So I'm going to measure mine. You do want to kind of stretch them just a little bit whenever you're measuring. I'm not sure if you can see this very well, but basically my pants are 17.5 inches wide. So you're going to multiply that by 2 to equate for both sides. So I'm going to need a 35-inch long waistband and then 5 inches tall. No matter what size your pants are, the 5 inches is going to stay the same. What's going to change is the length. So like I said, just measure how wide across your pants are and then multiply that by 2. Once you have your measurements, you're going to get your fabric again, and you're going to make, for me, a 35-inch long and a 5-inch wide just straight strip, and then you're just going to use your dimensions, do the same, and I'll show you how to piece it together to make a waistband after that. I do not think I'm going to have a 35-inch by 5-inch piece of scrap material in here, so I'm going to patchwork a waistband, and it's going to be just the same as how you've patchworked everything else. You're just going to make little chunks and serge or sew them together. Even when patchworking a waistband, don't forget to leave a little bit of overlap for seam allowance in between your pieces. Once you've serged together a straight waistband, you're going to want to make a loop. So put the right side inside. You can see I'm sewing the back here, and I'm going to make a loop out of my fabric. When you're done with your waistband, you're going to flip it right side out. Once you flipped it right side out, you're going to fold the waistband in half. An easy way to do that is just pick one of the seams, fold it over, and then work your way around. And here's what the waistband should look like. The back of your fabric should be facing in, and the right side should be facing out on both sides. Once you've picked the side you want to be on the front, you're going to flip your waistband the opposite direction. You don't want the back fabric to be facing out. The right side is still facing out. The waistband is just now upside down. Once you've done that, you're going to slide the waistband over the pants on both sides. Once you've slid the waistband over, you don't want to pin right here in the middle. You're going to pin or clip probably 6 or 7 inches apart. And the reason for that is you're going to put grommets right here in the middle, and that's how you're going to put the drawstring and the elastic through the pants. So whenever we sew and serge the waistband on, you're going to leave this middle section open and not do anything with it yet. I'm going to take 2 clips and clip outside of this middle section. Make sure when you're clipping, you're catching all 3 layers. There's going to be 2 layers of waistband and 1 layer of pants. The clips don't have to be evenly spaced necessarily, you just want a gap in the middle so we can come back in and do the grommets. Now that you have these two clips, you are going to go around the pants and clip all the way around. However, this is very, very important. Make sure that whenever you're clipping the pockets, they're kind of flimsy and loose right here, you want them to face forward whenever you clip them together. So I'll show you how to do that. So this is the front of my pants, correct? These are going to be my front panels. So I'm going to make sure that my pocket is not pinned on the back, but pinned on the front. The reason you do this is because when you put your hands in your pockets, you're sliding them in forward. You're not sliding them behind you. And if you pin the pockets on the wrong side, then you're not going to be able to put your hands in normally. You'll have to slide them behind you. I'm going to move to the other side and make sure that I pin the pocket correctly. And once I'm sure I have my pockets oriented right and I have a gap in the middle to leave open, I can pin or clip all the way around. Here you can see that the pockets are clipped to the front panel and not the back. And if you look all the way around, I've clipped all 3 layers, except for the section with the pocket. There's actually 5 layers, 2 layers of waistband, 1 layer of pants, and 2 layers of pocket. Once you go sew and serge these, do not forget that you leave this middle section open. Now that I'm going to serge these, I'm going to find that front section I wanted to leave open, which here it is right here. And I'm going to start on one side and go all the way around, and that way I know when I'm to the last clip, I'm supposed to stop. When you are serging or sewing this section, go over slowly because it is going to have to go over either 3 to 5 layers at one time. As you're going, also don't forget to make sure everything is lined up and that you're catching all the layers as you're going. Once the waistband is serged or sewn on, then you can flip it back up, and this is what your pants should look like, and you have a gap in the middle. I'm going to show you how to mark the grommets, but I'm not going to show you how to install them because I have a specialty machine that does that, and I don't think a lot of people have this, and if you do have it, you probably know how to use it. And so if you have any questions about how to install grommets, please feel free to comment below. I would recommend just going to Hobby Lobby or your local arts and crafts store and buying a pack of grommets, and they usually come with a little deal like this that's handheld that you smack with a hammer. And so if you guys want a tutorial on that, please let me know. But otherwise, the grommets, you're going to be on your own. But like I said, the packs that you usually buy at an arts and crafts store have an installment method on the back that is usually simple to follow. You're going to want to get another fabric marker or some sort of pinch. You can even use a Sharpie. I just am worried that I'll mark wrong and have to wash it out. And you're just going to place 2 dots equally apart from this middle crotch seam. You don't want them to be super close like this. It just looks weird and it's kind of hard to pull the drawstring when you're actually wearing the pants. I would recommend probably doing them 2 inches apart, but it's kind of just whatever you like. Just make sure that they are on the same level and they're the same distance from this middle crotch. Here is what mine look like. Now I'm going to cut a tiny hole, install my grommets, and you guys can do the same, and then we will come back and install the elastic. We're in the home stretch of making the patchwork sweatpants, and now you're going to add the elastic. The brand of elastic I use is called Sewology. This is obviously not the same elastic, but it is the same brand. I like this brand because it's very stretchy, which makes it more comfortable whenever I make the pants or shorts, because, you know, I'm a girl. I get bloated sometimes, and it just doesn't fit as comfortably whenever it's really tight elastic, so that is why I like this. If the pants are for yourself, you're just going to measure what feels comfortable around your waist. Whenever I have to make a custom for somebody else, I have a lot of family members and friends of lots of different sizes, so sometimes I will measure them. I look online for measurements, or I can still kind of guesstimate pretty well based on my body size because I know I am a medium in women's and a small in men's, and so usually that's just kind of how I guesstimate the size I'm going to do. So since these sweatpants are modeled after my pair of sweatpants, which means they're probably going to be for me, I'm going to measure on my own waist. All you have to do is wrap the elastic around your waist and pull it until it feels comfortable. If your elastic is really stretchy like mine, you do want it to be a little bit tight just so it's not falling off of you whenever you actually wear the sweatpants. As you can see, I'm pulling mine just a little bit, but about right here feels comfortable for me. And as always, remember seam allowance. Whenever you're going to sew or serge this together, you are going to cut a little bit off, so don't forget to add an extra ½ inch or maybe even a full inch. I think I like it about right here, so I am going to cut it. And once you have your strip of elastic, you're going to thread it through the waistband first and then sew it together. The easiest way for me to thread it through is to grab a safety pin, push it through the top, and then you're going to thread it through the waistband. This is another reason why you have this gap right here. It's not just to put the grommets in, but it's also to put the elastic in. When you're threading the elastic through, make sure it doesn't twist up like this. You want it to be perfectly straight so that it doesn't feel funky whenever you're wearing it. When you're threading it through, once you start kind of losing your tail of elastic, you're gonna have to pinch it and hold on to it while you thread the rest of it through. Whenever I get the safety pin through the other side, I like to put it through both ends so it makes the loop and I don't lose that tail inside and have to weave it through again. Once you get there, you can kind of stretch out your waistband and make sure it's the desired fit that you would like. Before you sew this together, don't forget to make sure that there's no kinks or twists like that inside the waistband. Once you've checked that, turn your sewing machine to a zigzag stitch. The zigzag is just going to make it more secure. If you want to do a straight stitch, that's fine, but I would recommend a zigzag. Take your safety pin out, place the elastic underneath the presser foot, and then you're going to zigzag probably 3 to 7 or 8 times just to make sure that it really is locked in place. Now that your elastic is sewn together, you can stretch out your waistband and you're going to go back to your serger or sewing machine and you're going to close this gap here. Whenever you're serging the rest of the waistband on, make sure you're not serging through the elastic on the inside. I secure my loose serger tails by just pulling on them until they tighten up and make a knot. After that, I cut the excess off. We are on to the final stage of making these patchwork sweatpants, and that is going to be to hem the bottom of the legs. So I didn't make my panels perfectly even, so first I'm going to cut off this little bit of excess, and once I've done that, I'm going to use my serger and serge around the edge. You're not serging them together, you're just serging them around the edge, and that's going to be your guide for whenever you make the hem with the sewing machine. I don't have a perfect method for this yet. I usually just line up the inseam straight on my cutting mat, and then I will just cut off that excess at the nearest hash mark there is. Whenever I do the other leg, I want to make sure I cut it at the same hash mark. And I'm going to be honest, I don't remember what hash mark I just did. So after I cut this, I'm just going to put the legs side by side and make sure they're even. They look even to me, so now you're going to serge around the edge. Don't forget to pull on the loose strings until it makes a knot. When you're doing the hem, you're going to fold over the bottom of the pant leg and you're just sewing it down. Usually a sewing machine will have these markings on the edge, so I'll fold it over and I either use the markings or the presser foot as my guide. For the hem of these sweatpants, I'm going to line up my serge edge with the left side of my presser foot and the folded edge with the right side of my presser foot. Don't forget to backstitch. And then as you go around, you're just going to fold over the edge and keep it lined up with the sides of the presser foot or whatever marking you are using. Once you overlap your stitching a little bit, backstitch and then forward stitch again just to keep it locked in place. Here's what it looks like on the inside, and this is what it should look like on the outside. You're going to do the same thing for the other leg. The patchwork sweatpants are basically done. The last thing to do is to add a drawstring. The drawstrings I use are just old shoelaces, and what I like to do is tie a knot on one side so it won't fall out, and then you just thread it through like a normal drawstring. Here are the finished patchwork sweatpants, and that is the entire tutorial, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to let me know. Like, comment, share, subscribe. That's always super helpful. And let me know if you want me to make more tutorials on how to make other upcycles or different variations of the patchwork sweatpants. You can do straight ankles like I did. You can do cinched ankles. You can add cargo pockets. You can do different waistbands. There's so many different opportunities. So please let me know what you guys would like to see, and I will see you possums in the next video.